Nobody ever says bedtime for Bonzo in the movie Bedtime for Bonzo. Not even Bonzo. Nonetheless, that phrase might be more well known than the movie itself. At least I know multiple people approximately my age whose parents would say that to them every evening when it was time to go to bed. When they were kids, I mean, although some of them, they still say it now. It's odd that your parents would address you as a chimpanzee, but so be it. It may be that mom and dad were huge movie buffs, or that they watched the movie back in 1951 when they were 1 year old. Maybe they saw a rerun on television. It did have a bit of a resurgence in the 1980s when its star, Bonzo, was the president of the United States. There's another place that your parents may have heard about this from. The movie was referenced a lot on the Johnny Carson show. Why? Perhaps because it was produced by Fred de Cordova, the director of Bedtime for Bonzo. Make a movie with a monkey, and you never know where you'll end up. And yes, technically, chimpanzees, I know they're not monkeys, but you get the idea. So, were your parents big movie buffs, or did they watch the Johnny Carson show? Unfortunately, Bedtime for Bonzo is not a great movie. I think it deserves a little more than the 5.5 out of 10 it has on IMDb, but people probably think of this movie mainly as the butt of a joke. And the premise, it is somewhat ridiculous, as many chimpanzee movies seem to be. But this is a real movie, a serious movie, although it is a comedy. It's not terrible. It's not terrible, but it's not that great. Really, the highlights are the japes from Bonzo. Unlike last week's movie, we have a real chimp in this one. Apparently, Bonzo was played by a chimp named Peggy. There's not a lot of information about Peggy online. No LinkedIn for Peggy, sadly. The chimp is well trained. It is kind of impressive. There are some decent stunts in the movie. A lot of the chimp scenes are shot separately from any of the actors, but you do see the chimp crawling all over Ronald Reagan for real a couple of times, and that's kind of fun. In 2025, this might not be as mind-blowing as it was back in 1951, and personally, I have somewhat mixed feelings about this kind of trained animal, I guess. I don't know. It was once a somewhat significant part of Hollywood, trained animals. I guess following on from the circus, not very popular in either of those domains today. Anyway, there are all kinds of plot holes in this movie. Basic stuff, characters walking out, but being there in the next scene. Of course, there's hardly any plot in the first place. I wouldn't say that the movie is particularly funny either. Somewhat amusing at best. It is very predictable, and it's dated. So I wouldn't really recommend Bedtime for Bonzo as anything other than an oddity, but it is a surprisingly interesting movie, and there are some things to talk about. If you haven't seen many Ronald Reagan movies, first of all, you might expect him to play maybe a macho character, but actually he's a bit of a nerd in this movie, a geeky psychology professor who's a bit awkward around women, a bit naive. This is a role that Reagan actually played more than once. For instance, there's the Virginia Mayo film, She's Working Her Way Through College, which is not as salacious as it sounds. Not very good movie either, but has an interesting performance from Gene Nelson in it, sort of a poor man's Gene Kelly. Gene Nelson, look him up. Anyway, Reagan is walking a tightrope as this sort of nerdy professor who is also quietly righteous. And also a little bit coyly macho. It's hard to describe, but if you've seen a movie like this, I think you'll know what I mean. Might not be exactly what you would expect. I can never really judge Reagan as an actor, to be honest. He always seems like a politician to me, or when I see his speeches, well, he always seemed like an actor. Honestly, I can admire his dignity, and his storytelling got a couple good jokes, but he never seems very sincere to me. Anyway, he's giving a comedic performance here, which is decent. It's not very dynamic, not exactly understated either. What's he doing? I guess mainly he's kind of the straight man in some ways, but there are some glimmers of goofiness as well. It's a decent comic performance, but most of the jokes, most of the japes, they come from the apes. They come from Bonzo. Or from a jolly Jewish professor played by Walter Slezak. Don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. He's got some decent lines. This is a Viennese character actor who's in a bunch of movies. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about the story. We're at a generic university. Things start at University State, the College of University State or something, which naturally has a chimp to do experiments on. Reagan is a professor of psychology who is engaged to the daughter of the dean. Okay, let's pause. This is an engagement story. You could call it a remarriage comedy, a term coined by Stanley Cavell in his book, Pursuits of Happiness. I was going to hold up the book, but it's on the bookshelf. Anyway, Pursuits of Happiness, which looks at a bunch of old movies where the wedding is off. Oh, but then it's back on again. Oh, no, wait, it's off again. Actually, I've decided to marry the blonde girl instead. Reagan upsets the dean at the beginning of this movie, and that puts his engagement in jeopardy. It brings us into this remarriage comedy thing, reevaluation of marriage, basically. Cavell has a bunch of things to say about these remarriage comedies. He sort of contorts his way into talking about renewal, how important it is to renew your vows or something. The main thing that comes to my mind when I watch a movie like this is simply that it was a very different time, when a man's biggest worry was if he had gotten engaged to the right woman. Marriage rates are not quite what they used to be, and I don't think people are as worried about, engaged to this person or engaged to that person, or maybe this girl over here. Engagement is not such a dramatic linchpin in film anymore. No surprise, I guess. Anyway, the only way Reagan can win back the dean and save his engagement is to secretly adopt the school chimpanzee. It all comes down to a disagreement about nurture versus nature. I won't get into the details because they're silly, not worth our time. But the dean, who is quite stuck up, thinks that criminality is a genetic trait. He says that explicitly. Criminality is a genetic trait. I hope not. On the other hand, progressive-minded Ronald Reagan thinks that it's all about the environment. And to prove this, he brings home the chimp. Of course, Reagan, at the time, was a Democrat. Reagan was a Democrat until the party started adopting some radical ideas, such as civil rights. Anyway, in this story, well, on the one hand, you've got some obviously wrong ideas about genetics. Did people believe that even in the 50s? I'm not sure, but today, some obviously wrong ideas about genetics. But on the other hand, you have My Fair Lady with a chimpanzee. Doesn't really seem like that's going to pan out either. Supposedly, this movie was based on research happening at Duke University, and there is research about whether chimps have empathy or a sense of right and wrong. But man, who let the biologists do studies about right and wrong? I don't know. These are murky waters. Bedtime for Bonzo obviously has no scientific rigor in it at all. It is hugely simplified and just sensationalized. And, you know, we get little snippets of Reagan writing out his findings or whatever, and they're a bit ridiculous. He's like, take a lot of pictures of Bonzo doing stuff so we can document this stuff. Interestingly, these pictures, later in the movie, we review them, and it actually turns out that they're videos. We see, this is maybe another little minor sort of plot hole or just inconsistency in these movies. We watch the pictures back later, and they're actually sort of home videos. Of course, they're filmed with a rock-solid tripod and all this stuff. Interesting that, you know, a film studies person would maybe be interested in the film within the film in this movie. But let's not get caught up in that. Anyway, in Bedtime for Bonzo, there is a real chimp, and this maybe lends a little bit of credibility to the sort of pseudoscientific angle of it, because obviously the chimp is pretty clever and kind of looks like it is adapting to the human environment. Look, the chimp is wearing clothes. Still, it's pretty clear that most of this is staged, that they've sort of lured the chimp into doing these various human-like things. Yeah, the movie is simplistic and sensational. Like I said, interestingly, Ronald Reagan has many times expressed his disdain for the follow-up, the sequel, Bonzo Goes to College, in which I think Bonzo plays on the football team. He said, this is just so unrealistic. The beauty of Bedtime for Bonzo is that it was grounded in real science. Well, no comment. Now, probably one of the hokiest, most dated, and most telling things about this movie is that while Reagan is mainly thought to train Bonzo on his own. I mean, you think about this movie, and it's like, well, Reagan, he trains Bonzo, right? The first thing he actually does is hire a woman to take care of the chimp. He hires a nanny to do all the work for him. This film strongly implies that a woman's touch is needed, that he couldn't even do it, right? And that there's some sort of domestic order to uphold here or whatever. Hey, another classic theme of old Hollywood is the idea of reconstituting the family unit. If you look at almost any classic movie, anything from the golden age of Hollywood, it will start out with various people, and it will end with the constitution of a family. That could be couple formation, but oftentimes it's more. It's like, a couple and some kids or whatever. So, it'll be like, look, there's the soldier and the soldier and like the Red Cross worker out in the wilderness. And, there's this random child walking by. And by the time you get to the end, they formed a couple and they've adopted the child, right? They've built a family. And this movie follows the same logic. It strongly implies that taking care of a chimp is basically the same thing as taking care of a child. They treat it like a human child. They start addressing themselves as mama and Papa, they give it a bottle to suck from, all this stuff. Like I said, it is telling that most people probably think this movie is about a man adopting a chimp, but it's really about a woman adopting a chimp. The setup of the domestic environment is, in some ways, probably the weakest part of the film, maybe the most telling, but yeah. I'm not saying this simply because, gender roles have changed or whatever, but this part of the movie is just extremely cheesy. The nanny, played by Diana Lynn, who actually started her career as a piano prodigy, interestingly, she says that they should call each other Mama and Papa. Well, they first say mother and father, daddy, mommy. They conclude scientifically. Reagan thinks about it professorially and decides Mama and Papa would be best. They do this so that the chimp has a sense of normal life. Consistency. They basically construct this American domestic life around this chimp/child. Anyway, they go so far as to give each other a big goodbye kiss every morning. Reagan asks Diana Lynn's character, Jane, I think is her name, asks Jane, well, what did your parents do every morning before they go off to work? And she says, we'd pick her up and give her a big kiss. And he says, interesting. Well, we should do this. I think there are adult films that have a more plausible plot than this movie. Probably this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. I think partly this is done for comedic effect, but the comedic balance has not survived almost 75 years, and the movie feels so clunky. Worth watching, like I said, only for some of the chimp's antics. I mean, he does a backflip. That's pretty cool. It is worth noting that a lot of the humor in this movie follows a familiar pattern of a non-human thing doing human things. I've talked a little bit about this in some of my videos about kids' movies, whether it's Cars or Robots or Madagascar. Kids' movies very often playfully mimic adult life. It seems like this may also be a common theme in chimpanzee movies. It was a part of last week's movie, for instance, putting a chimpanzee into a human situation. What could be funnier than that, right? Interestingly, this movie and the last one have pretty similar chimpanzee reveals, where one character assumes that another is talking about a human, right? In this movie, there's Reagan, the nanny comes over and he's like, yeah, well, I'll warn you, he's a monkey. And then he's like, of course, everybody says their kids are monkeys, right? You get this dramatic irony. The audience can lap up the dramatic irony as the characters edge closer and closer to realize that this thing they think is a human is really a chimpanzee, an ape. In kids' movies, mimicry probably has a lot to do with imagination and looking at adulthood from the outside, right? But in chimpanzee movies, I don't think that's quite what's happening. Something else is going on here. Is it really just that chimps are so human-like that everyone who makes a movie about them plays with that same boundary? Everybody ends up making the same sort of jokes about, like, look, the chimp's wearing clothes. Look, the chimp's making a phone call. Look, When we did the cat series, all the cat movies were completely different. I thought I might reach some sort of conclusion about cats. No way. Cats, they don't follow the rules. Of course, we knew this, but cat movies, there was no unified theory of cinematic cats whatsoever. But with chimps, so far, the movies have been very similar. The two I've seen, I mean, as different as they could possibly be, the two I've seen actually are so similar. Interesting. Interesting. And I know that the last week's movie has this angle of the intimacy between the chimp and the woman, but this film has its own sort of salacious undertones as well, not between the chimp and the humans, but with the couple formation. A lot of the same mechanics playing out in these movies, which is, it's interesting. Anyway, that's most of what I have to say about Bedtime for Bonzo. Next week, we have another chimp movie, and this one, you're going to like this. This one is a crossover with a previous series. Maybe you can guess what it is.